And we know also the problem, some countries are more dependent on China than others. And the influence of China towards ASEAN in certain agreements have been felt to be really real. And this is still a question mark for us. So between now and 2015, there carries risk for ASEAN whether the ASEAN community will in fact be able to meet its full potential. And whether in the face of China's increasing assertiveness and also the problems in the East Asia, ASEAN would be able to fulfill its potential of being the primary driver in regional architecture and peace building and so on. This is something that we need to watch very carefully.
Thank you, Budevi, for your interesting remarks. I think that I would pass the mic to...
Following up on Ibu Dewi remarks, I think if we talk about ASEAN, we simply cannot ignore Indonesia, because Indonesia is actually contributing about 40% in ASEAN economic community, and also if we also learned in the 90s that the first of the CEPT, which is Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement among ASEAN countries, actually Indonesia plays an very important role. Now, the risk is actually currently, which I see, is that Indonesia is vacuumed from the discussion. Last year, when Indonesia took the chairmanship in ASEAN, it's sort of like offer an initiative that, look, I mean, if we talk about greater regional economic integration, Indonesia wants to see a greater partnership in that context, which I think is a really great and relevant topic. However, the leadership will be tested. It is remain to be seen whether this new government in 2014 will remain committed to drive the idea, because as Bakrie mentioned, there are also other competing ideas on the table or in the room, which is TPP. Now, this is simply a beauty contest. In one hand, Indonesia is trying to put something on the table that hopefully could also appeal to ASEAN and plus the other members, 6 dialogue members, for example, China, India, Australia, and New Zealand. But at the same time, there's also a competing idea for really aggressive trade and investment liberalization driven by the United States. Now, as far as I understand, there are challenges in driving RCEP as well as TPP. On RCEP, pretty much this discussion is still around the modalities in which how we actually countries can agree upon a template for negotiation. And on this role, Indonesia actually plays an important role because it is the coordinator for our RCEP. At the same time, TPP, although it's really interesting, but I think the challenge will be how do you have an honest discussion and a frank discussion with countries in which state capitalism or the role of state-owned enterprise are still seen as important driver for economic development, such as in Malaysia and also Vietnam. So I think those are the challenges. But internally, I think here in Indonesia, I think everyone sees, I mean, this year is a year of consolidation. We've been seeing that the central bank has been actively pursuing measures to stabilize the economy, which it means that the growth will remain to be lower than it used to because of the idea of addressing current account deficit, etc. So the name, I guess, the priority for Indonesia for now and also perhaps next year is pretty much internal consolidation of its macroeconomic, but also in reform priorities. So the challenge is, also the big question for ASEAN is because Indonesia is seen as a leader, whether Indonesia still has the sort of enthusiasm to lead in 2014 and also 2015.
Thank you very much, Pak Syamsul, for your comments. I would like to move to our neighbors in Singapore. I would like to start with Pak Leonard Sebastian, a familiar face, to share his thoughts and views with the other panelists and the audience.
Regarding some concerns we have here in this part of the world. I think the key issue that we want to stress is ASEAN coherence. How will ASEAN evolve over the course of the next 10, 15 years will be fundamental. Institution building had been significant since the end of the Cold War. We've seen the development of first generation institutions that evolved after the end of the Cold War, specifically the ARF and institutions like that. But now we are moving into a second stage of institution building, the EAS, there is the TPP, the RECEP frameworks. The question is, where does ASEAN play its role? Is ASEAN the driver? Does ASEAN have a place then in the current security and economic frameworks going forward, considering the emergence of China, India, and of course our desire to see the United States more engaged over the next 5 to 10 years. So that is one point I want to stress, the whole issue of ASEAN coherence. The next issue is maritime security. We are observing now a destabilizing situation in the South China Sea, and our great concern is whether we will have consensus going forward on the type of norms that we want to see instituted in this part of the world regarding maritime security. Non-traditional security concerns also continue to plague us. We've seen the aftermath of the typhoon in the Philippines, and Ibu Devi has just mentioned the difficulties she's faced with the earthquake and the flood situation in Jakarta. But the reality is, how can we put in place secure, stable frameworks for humanitarian assistance and disaster prevention, considering the wide range of problems that we face in this part of the world. Bilateral relations are also frayed. Witness the problems between Cambodia and Thailand. How can ASEAN states move forward, build a more coherent relationship under the type of frameworks that we have adopted, while addressing some of these thorny bilateral problems that still exist? The ASEAN Economic Community, we would like to see more progress there. And I think going forward, we have to think in terms of perhaps in 2025, a new framework, a new blueprint to take the region to another level. The final point I want to stress is the importance of the role of Indonesia. I acknowledge the points of Ibu Devi. I think Indonesia will have a momentous election coming up in a few months, and we hope to see an Indonesia focused and certainly providing ideas and leadership in this part of the world. And we hope to see greater cooperation and deepening of the relationship between ASEAN and the United States in the years ahead, as we try to grapple with the new challenges that we see emerging in the Asia-Pacific region.
We give the mic to Prof. Ranu.
Thank you. Rana is my name. As the chair of factors that I think have placed Southeast Asia or ASEAN in limelight in the last few months, last year or so. First, as Vikram noted, Fed tapering has begun. It will be gradual over an extended period of time. Because of that, emerging markets all around the world are slowing. The BRICS are no longer the BRICS. Uh, South Africa, Russia, and Brazil are in fact growing slower than the US, lower than 2% per annum. So they have lost their speed. China is slowing down, but ASEAN is still going strong, as the chair, Mr. Aziz, mentioned at the very outset. In fact, in a conference recently, somebody wants to be this guy who coined the word BRICS from Goldman Sachs. I forget, Jim, right? Jim. Somebody talked about mint. I asked, what is mint? Mexico, Indonesia, now part of the world, Nigeria, and Turkey. They are the fastest growing emerging markets now. Mint. So in that context, ASEAN has come into limelight. Secondly, the problems in Northeast Asia, China, Japan now, and Vikram mentioned South China Sea and so on. So ASEAN is still very much involved in that. And Fortuna mentioned about, and also Leonard, of course, AEC 2015. Will we have the AEC by the end of next year? Will ASEAN make it or not? Let me give you my thoughts, the panel on ASEAN. I was very pessimistic about ASEAN until I started looking at it more carefully in the past 6-7 months. ASEAN, as we know, was founded in 1967. First decade of ASEAN was basically was spent on getting to know each other, garnering each other's trust, moving around, establishing the base. ASEAN started economic integration a decade after it was established. So after having established some sort of a base, it started economic integration, ASEAN PTA, AFTA, and of course there were challenges that were posed by China and other countries, which became obvious after the Asian financial crisis, when foreign direct investment was diverted away from ASEAN into these other countries. And ASEAN took a very bold move. It announced in 2007, the leaders announced that they would have the AEC by 2015. It was a very, very ambitious project. Aside from the EU, I am not aware of any other region that has stated that it wants to be an economic community. Economic community is one of the most advanced form of economic integration. Even NAFTA is a FTA, much lower than what ASEAN aspires to. Of course, EU is more advanced, but EU, the situation was very different after the Second World War. They wanted peace, they said no more war. A political will to integrate was very strong, so they could move quickly. But even in EU, those of us who study economic integration will find that the roadmap was not very smooth. When EU started integration under the so-called Treaty of Rome, they wanted to be an economic community. It didn't happen. They landed up with a customs union. So, but then they held on to the effort and all that. And in the early 80s, they came out with the Single Europe Act. Took a while. Finally, they became an economic union and then later a monetary. So the path to economic integration is very difficult, and ASEAN chose a very ambitious path. So whatever ASEAN has achieved so far must be looked at in that light. And if we do so, then the outcomes are not very pessimistic. I mean, ASEAN has achieved something. Of course, next year's deadline is a milestone, not an ending chapter. It's an important landmark in the path to economic union. So the journey has begun, maybe halfway there. As Leonard said, it will take time. Maybe by 2025, ASEAN will be closer to an economic union, maybe even 2030. But the challenges it faces